Hello, welcome to Panel G, Beyond a Boundary and James's Body of Work. I'm Rachel Douglas and I'm in French and Comparative Literature here at the University of Glasgow. And the first speaker is Christian Høgsbjerg, who's a historian and lectures at Leeds Metropolitan University. And he completed his PhD at York University. And as many of you will know from these beautiful flyers in your folders, he's also the editor of the new critical edition of C.L.R. James's first play based on the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint l'Ouverture, the 1936 play that was performed in London with Paul Robeson in the lead role. And it came out this year with Duke University Press in the new C.L.R. James archive series. And there's a lot of excitement surrounding this publication, because for, my maths isn't very good, but for 77 years, this play hasn't been available. And in addition to the play script itself, Høgsbjerg has written a brilliant critical introduction, which burrows very deep down into James's 1930s in England. And prior to this landmark publication, Høgsbjerg painstakingly transcribed the whole manuscript, and also contemporary 1936 reviews of the play, and then very generously shared them with a number of people. And his title is The Humbler Type of Cricket Scribe, C.L.R. James on Sport, Culture and Society in Imperial Britain. I'm not sure, but I think from his abstract, it looks like he's going to say something about James's profound connections with the revolutionary left in Scotland, and perhaps something about the remarkable book by James D. Young, which is very hard to get hold of. I haven't been able to order it for Glasgow University Library. And I think they tried to invite James D. Young, but unfortunately he's no longer with us, so he couldn't come. But the one thing he didn't talk about was cricket, the English game of cricket. So I just wanted to say, and also yesterday, some things that came up were the issue of English and British and Scottish. So this is all very relevant, and I think James often refers, I don't know what you think, but I think he often refers to England when he means Britain. And I don't think he's like David Livingstone of the David Livingstone, I presume, explorer, who would, he was a very canny operator and would present himself at times as being English, particularly if he was looking for money from various places. So I don't think it was like that at all. And I also wanted to say that I'm very glad that this conference is taking place in Glasgow, and I've just arrived in Glasgow, because there were these connections with, some of the people who James D. Young talked about, Nan McLean and Willie Tate, and his cricket reporting for the Glasgow Herald. But also because Glasgow is a city which is built on the proceeds of slavery. And if you walk around, particularly the merchant city part of the city, that's the part. And these merchants were tobacco lords, and they had interest in sugar. And some of the grandest buildings in the merchant city were built on the proceeds of slavery. And again, it's in the fabric of the city, the street names, there's Jamaica Street, there's Tobago Street. So I wanted to say that slavery is what powered Scotland's transformation from a small fishing hamlet to the biggest city in Scotland. And also, I just found out from someone who works here that there was even a Scottish-owned slave fort off the coast of Sierra Leone. It was called Bant's Island, and it featured a 2-hole golf course. And Scotland being the birthplace of that sport, golf, they would dress their slave caddies in tartan. So I think that having this particular event here is very welcome and very necessary. So thanks very much, Christian.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for that generous introduction. Yes, when this conference was, the abstracts were coming in for this conference, I wasn't initially going to give a paper, but then, as I say, there didn't seem to be one coming in about Scotland and about Scotland of a Black Atlantic and where C.L.R. James fits into this. So I felt there should be at least a place to discuss these kind of issues at the conference. I'm quarter Danish and 3/4 English, so I'm perhaps not the best person to lead such a discussion on Scotland and Scottishness. But the other reason I did want to also have this is just briefly to have a place where we could actually, if anyone did have any reflections or wanted to make any kind of reflections on the late Scottish socialist historian James D. Young, who passed away last year, or his important work on the world of C.L.R. James. It came out in 1999 with Clydeside Press. They could do so here. He'd met James in the 50s, and as a young socialist and in London. And he in many of his works, he does bring in James, he does talk about James in other kind of neglected works on labour history. But it was only really towards the end of his life, I think, he started putting together his thoughts on C.L.R. James per se. And therefore, he wasn't able to, because he was sort of in ill health, to actually do some of the primary research that I think he would have liked to have done about this. And so really my PhD, my work, I mean, James de Young described C.L.R. James's early years in Britain as some of the most obscure, I forget the phrase, kind of unknown areas of James's life. And really my PhD was on James in the first, and really trying to piece together some of this story. Young's, as Rachel mentioned, does his work it's called The World of C.L.R. James, but really it's whatever people think about the work, it is really the definitive work, likely to remain the definitive work on C.L.R. James in Scotland. It's precisely, because of James de Young knew people like Willie Tate and various other socialists in Scotland who knew James, and had done research in Stirling archives where the Tate papers are. I did have some correspondence with James de Young right at the towards the end of his life, and one thing I remember him saying was, you need to go to the University of Stirling archives, you need to spend 3 days there going through material there, and it's my shame I haven't done that yet, but it's hey. But I think he makes use of that in his own work. He does use that material quite a lot and integrates it a lot into his own work. He estimates that James often lived in the 30s with fellow socialists in Glasgow and Edinburgh for months at a time in austere circumstances, using his income from the Glasgow Herald to allow him to talk to and study working people in their clubs and pubs. And this is really why again, the connections with the Glasgow Herald. James wrote 50 columns on English cricket. He covered the seasons 37 and 38 for Glasgow Herald. And these columns really are, Andrew Smith, who's, I'm not sure who's in the room, has written a fantastic article on these columns, which I recommend people go and look at. And I'm just going to, I'm going to bring up some of this stuff. But the other point I wanted to make is just about that quote about James using his proceeds from the Glasgow Herald for political activity and socialist activity is important, because yesterday in one of the discussions, people mentioned, there was a small discussion about what James did with the royalties of Beyond a Boundary. And one thing that wasn't mentioned there, I felt could have been mentioned, is my understanding of this is, and I could be wrong, I'm open to correction, is that James, the draft manuscripts he wrote that became Beyond a Boundary, he donated to the anti-apartheid movement in Britain to raise money, so they could sell them and raise money for the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. So that gives a sense. I think they then became up for auction eventually now at the UE, my understanding is where these manuscripts have ended up now. But that's just, I just wanted to make that point, because it is, just give some sense of what James thought about money and so on. As Rachel said, James visited Scotland in 1934, 35, 36 and 38, apparently visiting Glasgow on 6 occasions in 1938, according to James de Young. Built friendships with Nan Maclean Milton, daughter of Scottish Revolutionary Socialist John Maclean. And Nan Milton recalled that C.L.R. James was keen to discuss the dialectic, but also helped around her house, telling her family and friends about Trinidad and cooking them West Indian dishes. She remembers he did most of the cooking, delicious food with fish and rice. He also escaped into pubs, and everyone knew he liked intelligent and attractive-looking women. C.L.R. James apparently told Nan Milton that he thought Scottish socialist convictions were more serious and radical than those of their English counterparts. And that's something James de Young really makes a lot of, is this kind of national radicalism of Scotland as opposed to England. And it's true that there's a quote from, I think, 1941, where C.L.R. James mentions Glasgow as the intellectual centre of British labour. He refers to how various Trotskyist publications were more widely read in Glasgow than anywhere else. And also, if anyone's around Glasgow for a few days, I recommend visiting the Glasgow Caledonian University archive of the Trotskyist tradition. There's a fantastic run of, I looked through papers of the Spanish Revolution, which was the English language poem supporting publication during poem was a faction of the Spanish Civil War, and it was linked to the RP. They did, there's a fantastic run of papers reporting from the Spanish Revolution, trying to win English socialists to show solidarity with the Spanish Civil War, Spanish Revolution. However, I think there's a slight problem with Young's. He makes too much, I think, of this, of counterposing Scottish socialist radicalism to English socialist radicalism. His own book testifies to the fact that, for example, at James was quite rare as a black political activist in Scotland, as opposed to, say, the circles in London in the 1930s. Apparently at a National Council of Labour Colleges social in 1938, held in Scotland, they sang a song called the Darkies Sunday School. And C.L.R. James obviously naturally objected to this and apparently pointed out that generations of humanity who would grow up in a future socialist society would not recognise such categories as black or white. Willie Tate remembers James speaking on the Empire in Revolt at Bacardi Place Hall, which I think might be Edinburgh, in October 1938, just before C.L.R. James left for the United States. And Tate remembers, he describes hearing James speak at such a mass meeting was the experience of a lifetime. He says the workers who attended thought it was great that a black man could talk to them about socialism. So you get that kind of, a sense. Yet, as Rachel said, James de Young himself, and perhaps again for reasons relating to his own Scottish nationalism, didn't dwell on James's writings on cricket at all. In fact, they're barely mentioned here in the book at all. It's paradoxical in a way. And I think one issue is this Englishness, this question of Englishness. There's a point C.L.R. James said in one of his 1938 columns, in the Glasgow Herald of all papers, where he said, cricket was and remains a game, a wonderful game, the practice, history and very jargon of which enshrine in a truly extraordinary manner the spirit and tempers of the English people. And for all James's kind of West Indian nationalism, all his Marxist internationalism, he had few qualms about getting involved in the intricacies of performances and composition of the English national team in order to write his columns. So he says, for example, Walter Hammond was a master in his prime. He will make centuries for England yet. He says, all who have seen Dennis Compton agree he has the makings of a great player. On the other hand, someone called Jim Smith is an admirable bowler and wise, but the village whirlings of his bat have never been looked upon as serious. I think they deserve attention, though, and I think they do deserve attention for James's early cricket writings for several reasons. One, James's reading of cricket operates only on the basis of a careful reading of the forms of cricket itself. He insisted anyone seeking to understand the game in social terms had to first understand the game in its own terms. And I think it's perhaps one reason why, if you look superficially through the Glasgow Herald columns, you see various, details of snapshots of England cricketers and what they were doing, and favourites, particular styles, favourite strokes of certain individual players in the England team, and so on. And yet, the average sort of Trotskyist, I guess, at the time, they just wouldn't. What are you doing? What are you doing, C.L.R. with this? And without understanding how, by attending to the specificities of these intricacies of these players, James was then able to abstract out and rise from the sort of concrete to the general and make wider points. And there were wider points he made. James was, one thing I want to bring out is James, the way that his political activism, as an anti-colonial activist, anti-capitalist activist, and in the 30s, corresponded with his own cricket writing to some extent. I don't need to talk too much about how cricket was, growing up in Trinidad, was obviously key to this, and James, how he describes how he was cricket introduced him to politics before he was kind of political and so on. But it's also remarkable how James was just, as a black colonial subject, having this prestigious post, from the Manchester Guardian from 33 to 35, and then Glasgow Herald, how he was, in this position, how he was able to kind of just comment on something, on a game that was tied up with empire, tied up with kind of Englishness and imperialism. There was one English cricket correspondent in 1937 wrote, "Today cricket has developed far beyond the imagination of its early players. The fortunes of a few flannelled men upon a green field are responsible for the state of mind of thousands of people in different quarters of the earth. The game has become a business, a means of livelihood to hundreds, and the principal item of news in the daily journals of the British Empire." And James describes, he said, "It was a great feeling to sit beside the Times in the number one seat allowed to the Manchester Guardian at Old Trafford, Lancashire's home cricket ground." Given all this, he was Paul Buell says that James was the first West Indian, the first man of colour to serve as a cricket reporter for the Guardian. Yeah, I try and make the argument, which I might have to expand on later if people ask, how this work gave him an opportunity to cast his gaze over a custom and practice that was not just arguably the national game in the imperial metropole itself, but since its golden age had become a game of English-speaking peoples across the empire. I also want to try and make a point about how his early writing feeds into Beyond the Boundary. The very title of this paper is sort of a humbler type of cricket scribe, as James described himself in 1938, alludes to kind of ancient Greece and some of the themes that developed later on in Beyond the Boundary. Of course, Beyond the Boundary is much more than James's early cricket writings, I'm sure. Joseph's paper is going to explore, and clearly the shift to America is important for James methodologically, theoretically, in terms of conceptualising what became beyond the boundary. What's interesting, in 1933, James comes to Britain. Hitler comes to power in 1933. The world, as James puts it, goes political. I go with it. And there's one nice piece from August 1933 when he's reporting Lancashire playing Hampshire at Old Trafford. And James attempts to apply a class analysis of sorts. James is just getting political. He's starting to read Marxist theory in his spare time while he's a cricket journalist. And he's talking about Hampshire players. He says, boys, long, slim and graceful, fielded at short leg with an aristocratic boldness and easy skill. Captain Philip Meade had little to do, but was pleasant to watch his good-humoured proletarian amble from slip to one end to slip at the other. Kennedy supplied the solid bourgeois virtues of length, flight and spin. He remained a dangerous bowler, never degenerating into negative theories. James himself was certainly trying at this period, was radicalising politically, he was degenerating himself nicely into sort of Marxism, at a good-humoured proletarian amble, perhaps. And he joins the Trotskyist movement in 1934. There's another nice just little piece where I just like this bit. It's a Lancashire playing Hampshire, and it's in July 1935, and readers of the Manchester Guardian on this Monday 29th of July 1935, would have read James describe an incident that took place during this match, played down in Southampton on the Saturday before. The dullness of the innings was enlivened by music from a loudspeaker, a brass band singing, and periodical discharges from a gun, with all of which the local Conservative Party made demonstration in the stadium next door. While it sounded far more exciting than the cricket, the gunfire next door continued with no regard for the batsman's concentration, and one Lancashire batsman, a guy called Painter, nearly got dismissed by what James called a political diversion. And James writes, cricket should be kept well away from politics. However, a mere 10 pages later, in that very issue of Manchester Guardian, readers closely reading the Manchester Guardian might have been startled to discover a report of a meeting of the International African Friends of Abyssinia, held in London the previous evening, the Sunday evening, where they could read their beloved cricket reporter, C.L.R. James, as chair of a militant Pan-Africanist group set up in solidarity with Ethiopia at the time when Mussolini was threatening war on that country. Apparently, James gave a lucid history of the European treaties with Abyssinia and declared Abyssinia is a symbol of all that Africa was and may be again, and we look on it with a jealous pride. Another report of that meeting shows that James he's talking about how black Pan-Africanists in Britain are actually going to be prepared perhaps to go and fight in Ethiopia against Mussolini, potentially. Yes, after that slight political diversion, James then returns on Monday to cover the next game, the continuing match between Lancashire and Hampshire down at Southampton. I just wanted to have a show this slide as well. This is a lovely slide. This is 1938. This is a charity match C.L.R. James plays in Nelson, Lancashire. So you've got Mary Constantine, this absolutely central figure for James in this period. George Headley, who Robert Hill mentioned there, C.L.R. is there. There's other people, lots of people in this photo are noteworthy. I mean, Atchong, who was, I think, is the Chinaman, who turned type of bowl. Chinaman. This is Peter Millard, who was Robert can tell us more about it. He's a very important trade unionist, I think, on the Panama Canal. I think it's Caribbean Labour militant. And then here's him as a sort of veteran playing this match. So it's I just thought show that. It's and James reports in Beyond the Boundary describes his time as a cricket reporter in Britain during the 1930s, his happy days. He says, if I was writing the usual type of cricket reminiscences, I would have plenty to say. And he covered all sorts of matches as a cricket journalist in the 30s, following Lancashire around the country, doing battle against other county sides, to national celebration matches like Gentlemen versus Players, England versus the rest, North versus South, and the thrilling heights of the 1938 Test Series, England-Australia, which there's little something in your packs. You should one of the reports in your packs. And James says he says in Beyond the Boundary, he says, when I went round English cricket grounds reporting the matches of the Lancashire team, or when I watched all the Test matches during the season of 1938, these were times when I could sense the course of an over from the way the batsman stood waiting between balls. And he wrote in 1937, a nice piece, he said, you can usually tell a great batsman even when he makes only 10 runs, though few of us can reach that height of perspicacity which enabled the late Sidney Parson, after watching Victor Trumper make 1 and then 0 against Essex in 1899, declare he was the finest batsman which had ever come from Australia. Anyway, and it's clear that James said, James as he travelled around as a cricket journalist, length and breadth of England, again, as he says somewhere else, and beyond the boundary, it meant I expanded my knowledge of cricket, and always, as always with cricket, of life in general. And I haven't really got time to go into it, but I think that if sport was really one of the most powerful of England's civil cultures in this period, and you see it at Nelson, you know, the huge support, you know, 10,000 people or whatever will come out on a weekly basis to watch like Leary Constantine play in the Lancashire League. You know, James's writings on cricket, I think, in this period are fascinating. They really go to the heart of the question of kind of national culture or perhaps imperial metropolitan culture as anything else written by a Marxist in this period of the 1930s, I would suggest. There's a bit about, I want to talk about perhaps the bodyline controversy, because James writes about that in Beyond the Boundary, and how he talks about how, you know, bodyline controversy later on in Beyond the Boundary is about this. He says it's about the violence and ferocity of our early age expressing itself in cricket. The time was the early 30s, the period in which the contemporary rejection of tradition, the contemporary disregard of means, the contemporary callousness were taking shape. The totalitarian dictators cultivated brutality of set purpose. He says it beyond about it. It began in World War I. Exhaustion and a fictitious prosperity in the late 1920s delayed its maturity. It came into its own in 1929. Cricket could no more resist than the other organisations and values of the 19th century were able to resist. But big cricket survived the initial shock at all as a testimony to its inherent decency and the deep roots it had sunk. And this is really one of the themes that runs throughout James's writing, the sense that about cricket's got an inherent decency. And you get it a sense with Mike Brearley was talking about in the panel before, how even commercialisation coming in, how, yes, it degrades cricket, but it doesn't necessarily invalidate cricket. Cricket can survive these kind of pressures. And James is some sense about some of these sort of totalitarianism. And James was conscious of all these different ways in which cricket was being potentially in threat. There was the Nazis, if you think about the Olympic Games, what the Nazis, the way they're using propaganda about the Berlin Olympics. The time James comments on that, for example, and Warring Side, at one point he says, I can't find the quote to hand, but he talks about, if it's a good job, he says, that cricket matches aren't played in most of the countries of Europe, France and Germany and stuff in this period. He says, otherwise the League of Nations might be needed to official and preside over these kind of test matches if they were. He's conscious of this stuff. The key reason why he thought cricket could survive inherent decency is it comes back to the crowd and the role that, as I think the crowd and the crowd's watching, and this is, when he's talking about Englishness, he's really talking about English people. People is the word, not Englishness and stuff. He's really stressing, and you can see this in these writings in the period, how it's people, and you get this in the crowd militant, the piece from 1938. I'll just read a little bit from that. It's there's a Nottingham Test match, and the English crowd are barracking Fingleton, Australian batsman, and so on. He says, barracking was unintelligent, but Fingleton and Brown made an appeal against the light at 5:30, reason for which was invisible to mortal eyes except theirs. Then he goes again and said, but the crowd reasserted itself before the end of the day and carried off all the honours. The occasion for this splendour was the dismissal of Fingleton. The greatest catch in the game, a long stretching left-handed effort at first slip sent back Fingleton, and the time was 6:15. Would Don Bradman come? He means everything to the Australian side, and I would wager that more than one of his men must have offered to go instead. He would be a fool to come, whispered a wise and experienced critic at my side. And then in the gathering darkness came the Australian captain, striding down the pavilion steps as jauntily as ever, and never so much for Don as in this brave gesture. Practically the whole ground stood up and greeted him with roars and roars of applause that lasted almost all the way. The barrackers appreciated his courage and wanted to let him know that the little unpleasantness with Fingleton was merely an interlude. It was the biggest moment of a game which had many, and if only a crowd could be as unintelligent as to barrack Fingleton and Brown when they were saving the game, what else but a crowd could so spontaneously and generously lift up all hearts and justify humanity? Andrew Smith, in his piece on the Glasgow Herald, where he talks about how some of James's early writings here, which I just recommend people go and read, he says you get there a glimpse of the universal, really, as well. Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks. So our next speaker is Joseph Keith, who is Associate Professor of English at Binghamton University, which is part of State University of New York. He was educated at Columbia and Johns Hopkins, And he's author of a book that's just come out entitled Unbecoming Americans, Writing Race and Nation from the Shadows of Citizenship, 1945 to 1960. So I look forward to reading that, published by Rutgers University Press. And is currently working on a new project entitled America's Archipelagos, Islands and the Anomalous Geography of Empire. And his title for today is From Mariners, Renegades and Castaways to Beyond a Boundary, C.L.R. James and the Politics of Form.
Thanks. And thanks, Rachel. And I wanted to thank Andrew, who's not here, and the rest of the organizers for inviting me to this conference on James. And as Rachel mentioned, I'm going to be speaking today primarily on Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways. But speaking in particular about the question of form and about the politics of form in James's work, particularly during this period in the U.S., and as such, hopefully very much having in mind Beyond a Boundary in the background as sort of developing methodology and politics of form in his work during this period. So in 1952, in a story that's well known to people here and that we discussed yesterday, James was arrested by the INS after months of harassment by the FBI and arraigned on passport violations. The state subsequently designated James, who had been living in the U.S. for the previous 14 years and had applied for legal citizenship in 1947, a subversive, and therefore subject to deportation under the McCarran-Walter Act. Passed in 1952, in the climate of the Cold War's founding years, the Act gave U.S. immigration officials the unprecedented authority to arrest without warrant, hold without bail, and deport for an action that was legal when committed any of the 2.5 million aliens residing in the U.S. James then served out a 6-month internment on Ellis Island as he waited for his case to be processed. In one of the many cruel ironies of the early Cold War, the island had been reopened 2 years earlier and converted from the largest port of entry for immigrants into an INS prison used for holding individuals the state wanted to deport. It was there that James worked on Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, a work he thought might help his case to remain in the U.S. Indeed, when James finished the manuscript, he sent copies to the Court of Appeals and to the House of Un-American Activities, along with a request for a $1 donation to his defense fund. It was a wonderfully Jamesian gesture, Stuart Hall has remarked. It was as though he were saying, quote, "You do not understand your greatest artist, Melville, and I do. How can you expel me for un-American activities when I'm telling you that next to Shakespeare, here is the greatest use of the English language? You should welcome me, not throw me out." The state, however, was unimpressed. Citing as evidence several of his other writings and his involvement with various quote-unquote radical organizations, they denied his request, and James was deported as an undesirable alien. James's book did not fare much better. Until its most recent reissue under the editorship of Donald Pease in 2001, the book James initially wrote was never republished in its complete form. In particular, the final chapter of Mariners, in which James provides a personal account of his internment on Ellis Island, was either edited out completely, as in the 1978 edition, or reduced to but a few pages in the 1985 edition. Neither edition supplies a reason for the cuts, but what these editorial decisions suggest, at least implicitly, is that the inclusion of a personal memoir of incarceration was irrelevant to the book's greater significance, James's literary reading of Moby Dick. Put in slightly different terms, the earlier editions testify to the type of formal and generic problems that James's unusual book poses, namely that its unruly form, mixing criticism with personal memoir, as well as with political commentary and with history, needed disciplining into a more coherent or recognizable format of literary criticism. I would like to suggest, however, that these efforts to reform James's text do not merely reflect a misunderstanding about what Mariners actually is, but also provide a poignant example of the very categorizing drive of disciplinary formations that James's text seeks to transgress. I want to argue that Mariner's form, in particular its formal transgressions of generic boundaries, rather than being an obstacle to the book's underlying content, is in fact central to it, to its effort to extend the scope of what constitutes legitimate knowledges, to include other forms marginalized by prevailing generic and correspondingly epistemological and political boundaries. In turn, Mariner's might be read in this context as also providing a crucial precedent to the unique form and formal politics of James's subsequent and equally generically unruly work Beyond a Boundary. Critics who have focused on the connection between Mariner's and the context of its writing have often read the book as James's attempt to use Melville's novel to comment, whether critically or appeasingly, on the state of America during the early Cold War. Perhaps most influentially, Donald Pease argues that in rereading the text from the standpoint of incarceration, Mariner's operates as a juridical appeal against James's imprisonment and against a form of U.S. fascism emerging during the period. James stages this critique, Pease argues, by using his exclusion from the nation as a standpoint from which to tell the untold tales of Melville's crew, of colonial exploitation, of migrant labor, of empire, stories whose recovery challenged the coherence of the nation and resituated it and the entire field of American studies within a critical global frame. While building on this argument, I want to add or focus not merely on the content of James's analysis, but instead, as I've already suggested, on its form. Specifically, I'm interested in James's effort to rethink, through an anti-colonial and Marxist lens, the potential political limits of the realist novel form in general. That is, the stories of the mariners, renegades, and castaways, of the racialized migrant laborers and refugees on both the Pequod and Ellis Island, emerge precisely at the ideological and representational limits of Melville's novel and the United States. Thus, telling their untold tales required not only different content, but just as importantly, different cultural forms if those stories and subaltern knowledges were to be represented. As such, rather than simply representing an odd or politically motivated literary interpretation of Moby Dick, James's Mariners can also be read, I suggest, as James's attempt to enact precisely this different form of representation, one that might enable the emergence of these racialized non-national migrant laborers as a new social group. In his 1952 introduction to Mariners, James describes the influence of the scene of the book's writing. He writes, quote, "A great part of this book was written on Ellis Island. The island, like Melville's Pequod, is a miniature of all the nations of the world and all the sections of society. My experience of it and the circumstances that attend my stay there have so deepened my understanding of Melville and so profoundly influenced the form the book has taken that an account of this has seemed to me not only a natural but necessary conclusion." James thus presents Mariners not merely as an interpretation of Melville's work, though it is that, and still less as an explanation of it, but instead as a recounting of the experiences surrounding his own reading of the text. Specifically, James finds in his own personal experience a link to that of the crew on the Pequod, a shared experience out of which James positions himself not only to reread or reinterpret Melville's work, but more importantly to also retell it, to present, as it were, his own version of the story of Moby Dick. The story that emerges is one in which the mariners, renegades, and castaways represent the novel's main protagonists and central ethical agents. Yet James is not simply proposing an idiosyncratic reading, nor is he merely reimagining Melville's work. Instead, James rearranges large sections of Moby Dick, offering pages and pages of quotations cut from the original in order to render the tale, he suggests, that Melville had actually initially set out but failed to tell. In this respect, Mariners represents less an effort to provide a definitive analysis of Melville's work. Rather, James transvalues his own alienage on Ellis Island into an analytic opportunity from which to recover and retell the intended but untold tale of Moby Dick. the story Melville wanted to tell but did not. Consider this moment that James extracts from Melville's novel. If to the meanest mariners and renegades and castaways I shall hereafter ascribe high qualities, though dark, if even the most mournful, perchance the most abased among them shall at times lift to the most exalted mount, then against all mortal critics bear me out in it, thou just spirit of equality, which has spread one royal mantle of humanity over all my kind. James argues that while Melville professed such lofty goals, they remained unachieved. Instead, he wrote the story as the conflict between Ahab, the ship's totalitarian captain, and Ishmael, its resident intellectual. James uses the passage above as evidence that merely clearly, quote, intends to make the crew the real heroes of his book, end quote, but he does not. Because, James writes, he is, quote, afraid of criticism, or as elsewhere he puts it, quote, he was doubtful that people would understand him, end quote. For James, Melville's fear of criticism and intelligibility was both a political and aesthetic fear. In other words, to have made the crew the main characters of his novel in 1851 would have been both politically and aesthetically in bad form. In his book on character in the 19th century realist novel One versus the Many, Alex Wallach argues that within the realist novel there exists a tension between a desire on one hand to tell the story of many characters, the many, and an inevitable turn to an attention to a few or single protagonist, the one. Wallach argues that this quote, asymmetric structure of characterization in which many are represented but attention inevitably flows toward a delimited center registers formally the tensions or the limits of the 19th century bourgeois political imagination. He writes, quote, in my reading of the realist aesthetic, a dialectical literary form is generated out of the relationship between inequality and democracy. In the paradigmatic character structure of the realist novel, any character can be a protagonist, but only one character is. Just as increasing political equality and a maturing logic of human rights develop amid acute economic and social stratification. In other words, the 19th century realist novel expresses a growing democratic impulse to tell the story, to literally represent the many, at the same time that it inevitably privileges a hierarchical attention to the singular, whose emergence as the main character or protagonist in fact ultimately depends upon the silencing or the effacement or the minoring of the many. Wallach's argument here provides a useful frame for situating James's rereading or retelling of Moby Dick. That is, James finds in Melville a similar political desire to tell the story of the many, of the crew, but he ultimately turns his narrative attention instead to Ishmael, the one, quote, for fear of criticism. In this respect, Mariners can be read less as James's interpretation of the original than his effort to tell that more radically democratic, untold story of the many, specifically the story of the collectivity of laborers marked by race and empire, the mariners, renegades, and castaways of the modern and postmodern world. It is this story that James's retelling ultimately draws forth, of the racialized non-national laborers whose work sustains the lives on board the ship and that has built U.S. society, but which remains minored by the novel and silenced by the nation. In 1851, James writes, while white American officers provided the brains, not 1 in 2 of the thousands of men in the fishery, in the army, and the engineering forces employed in the construction of American canals and railroads were Americans. They came from all over the world, were islanders from places like the Azores and the Shetland Islands. Nearly all on Ahab's ship were islanders. And it is in attempting to tell this story of the special collectivity of non-national workers that James can be understood as challenging the very political or ideological limits of both the bourgeois political imagination and the aesthetic imagination of the realist novel, and that thus required from James a different political and cultural form of representation. Ultimately, Mariners can be read as James's struggle to do exactly this, to both imagine and enact a different cultural and correspondingly political form. As James himself wrote in a letter to J. Leda, quote, each historical rebel rebels against something very specific, and it takes a specific literary form precisely because of its specific social character. But what might exactly this form of the radical many be? Here I want to turn to the final chapter of Mariners, a natural but necessary conclusion, in which James abruptly turns from a discussion of Moby Dick to a discussion of his incarceration and about his fellow prisoners, at the end of which he concludes, "This is my final impression. The meanest mariners, renegades, and castaways of Melville's day were objectively a new world, but they knew nothing. These," referring to his fellow Ellis Island inmates, "know everything." The symbolic mariners and renegades and castaways of Melville's book were isolados, federated by one keel, but only because they had been assembled by penetrating genius. These were federated by nothing, but they were looking for federation. In the larger project, I discussed James's significant use of federation here to describe the crew as his attempt to imagine a new political form of belonging in distinction both to bourgeois liberal citizenship and to the socialist model of the proletariat, as well as prefiguring his emerging post-colonial vision of West Indian federation. But for today, what I want to focus on is how the above passage also registers the question of James's own relation to these mariners, renegades, and castaways, and the question of, again, how to represent them not only politically, but aesthetically. That is, it brings to the fore the central issue of the relationship between the intellectual and the people, a question James dealt with throughout his career. In other words, Melville was able to federate the crew through the form of the novel, but James, as he suggests here, is looking for a form of representation that might allow the crew, in a sense, to represent themselves. It is important to emphasize that James at the time was highly critical, as many people have spoken about, of the revolutionary theory of vanguardism, and was attempting to develop as an activist a theory of what he called self-activity, which emphasized the capacity for self-government from below, or what he deemed the, quote, spontaneous expressions of the workers themselves. For James, I think there was always a slight tension in regard to the form of the novel, in that it functioned in certain respects like a vanguard party, that is, an individual representing the people. Thus, if these contemporary mariners, renegades, and castaways were, quote, looking for federation, what form might James find that did not put him in the similar position of the vanguard, or of Melville, or worst of all, the Pequod's resident intellectual Ishmael? It's a question, I think, very much central as well to Beyond a Boundary, and it's worth noting how at the end of Chapter 1 in Beyond a Boundary, James explicitly links his break with Trotskyism with the development of both of these works. Other critics have addressed this question of representation in James. In a reading of Minty Alley, for instance, Hazel Carby argues that James's early and only novel takes as its subject the question of cultural representation. Focusing on the novel's narrative device in which the main character observes the people in the barracks yard through a hole in the wall, Carby argues, quote, its central paradigm is the problem of how the intellectual can represent the Trinidadian proletariat. It stages James's keen awareness of a certain alienation, that the intellectual cannot be separated from the intellectual as a member of the class that shaped him as he attempts to represent the quote-unquote many. It is worth emphasizing here how James's career was marked by his remarkable move across so many different genres: histories, plays, criticism, journalism, popular culture, sports. Often seen, and rightly, as evidence of James's wildly eclectic interests, we might also read it as an ongoing effort by James to find a form and genre capable of addressing this problem of representation Carby outlines. My point here is that in Mariners, James is trying to do exactly this, right? To address this problem of representation and the question of the privileged, one might say, vanguard relationship of the intellectual or author to the people. And it is finally in this context that we might reapproach James's conclusion. It is written, first of all, in the form of a personal memoir of his incarceration. Quote, the first thing that happened, it begins, was that within an hour of my arrival, I was placed in a special room for political prisoners, end quote. Throughout the subsequent conclusion, James is no longer reading Moby Dick, but carefully documenting not only his own experiences on Ellis Island, but also those of his fellow inmates, a global amalgam of working-class migrant men, sailors, workers, and even a castaway, clearly intended to embody the class of mariners, renegades, and castaways Melville had prefigured a century earlier. He relates story after story that begins thusly, quote, "There was a Canadian soldier, a man put in as a mental case," end quote. Or, "Another case was that of an Irishman." Or, "There was a young Latin American sailor whose story provided a particularly astonishing tale of tyranny." In short, out of his shared social status as a prisoner and a minored character, James documents the untold tales and subaltern knowledges of his fellow mariners, renegades, and castaways. Walter Benjamin deemed this type of practice that of the storyteller, distinguishing it from the role of the author upon which the form of the modern novel is founded. Benjamin situates the storyteller within a communal tradition based upon remembering and relaying the experiences and tales of others. For Benjamin, the model of the storyteller comes from two different historical sources: the trading seaman who travels to distant lands, and the resident tiller whose familiarity with the local environment gives some privileged understanding of the tales and traditions of the community in which he is so rooted. Perhaps we might consider James thus in these terms not only the author of Mariners, but also the storyteller of the incarcerated heterogeneity of minor characters on Ellis Island and who built U.S. society. In this respect, while it has been read either as an awkward and unnecessary addendum to his literary analysis of Melville's novel, or as part of his political protest against incarceration, James's conclusion can also be considered as a natural but necessary conclusion to the book's inquiry into the politics of form. That is, Mariners maps a development through form, moving from the novel to James's effort to develop in his contemporary moment a different cultural form, a form of cultural studies in which James records the stories of the crew themselves. It is now their penetrating genius, as James emphasizes. They know everything. It is in this context that we might thus see Mariners as a crucial precursor to Beyond a Boundary, in which James reads the postures and swings of cricket batsmen as modes of social representation. Finally, my interest is not in deciding whether James is successful or not in this effort. That is, whether James to some extent does not end up reproducing somewhat the role of the author of his fellow inmates' revolutionary energy, but rather in recognizing it. For in identifying James's effort, I want to argue, in recognizing it and considering Mariners as a different form or genre of cultural production is significant not only for reappraising James's text, but also for working again to extend the scope of what constitutes valid forms of knowledge, to include other forms and genres whose transgressive force of expression have been excluded or minored by prevailing generic or disciplinary formations, including, or perhaps especially, the novel as the overwhelmingly privileged form of representation in the field of postcolonial studies. Indeed, the fact, once again, and I think that has ideally resonance for thinking about the form of Beyond a Boundary as well, what he's doing there. Indeed, the fact, once again, that Mariner's conclusion was edited out of previous versions suggests that what James was attempting to do, his effort to transgress formal or generic boundaries in order to retell these untold tales of the novel, remained somewhat illegible or in need of disciplining, and thus served to minor these stories all over again. In the end, then, while a reading of Moby Dick, Mariners might also be read as an attempt to decenter the realist novel and an effort to articulate this different representational mode, one that might rethink the relationship between the intellectual and the people, a formal and correspondingly political project that would be very much at the heart of the wonderfully unruly form of his subsequent classic, Beyond a Boundary.
Thank you very much.
My comment is related to the first paper by Christian. If you walk down Jamaica Street, which was mentioned by Rachel, to the Clyde, and look left, you'll see a monument to the International Brigade in the Spanish Civil War. And there you'll read numbers, I don't know them exactly, but to the effect that some 1,400 people went from Britain to fight in the international brigades. Out of those, something like 250 came from Glasgow, and out of those 50-odd died. So the comment that you made about Glasgow being the centre of working class movements at that time is, I think, very apt, and it's shown in the figures itself. But of course, the majority of that group who went and fought and died, especially from Glasgow, would have been members of the Communist Party. And therefore I think it's useful for us to remember that the groups which James might have been associating with then were very much peripheral groups, even though Maclean had an enormous reputation in the city. I'm talking about John Maclean in himself. The question I really want to ask you is, you mentioned, I think, that James was here, and I don't know the book, but thank you for letting me know, I'll look at it now. But James was here between 35, 36, 37 and 38. Do you know if he ever came back to Scotland?
The point about yeah, it was the heartlands, you know, the Communist Party, the ILP, and James, he was a member, you know, he's a member of the Trotskyist group inside the ILP, so he would be at times he'd be coming up and speaking, you know, with the ILP. Other times he'd be coming up, and the group he was around was the Revolutionary Socialist Party. I think they were kind of an American Revolutionary Socialist League, sort of inspired by sort of Daniel de Leon. Kind of group. Young discusses this at quite some length. His friendship with Willie Tate, though, I think did go into in the post-war period. But he was like this. He was someone who went to the first conference of the Fourth International, I think, with C.L.R. James and Denzil Dean Harbour. So he might well have come up to visit Willie Tate. It's possible. He certainly had connections with Scottish socialists after. Yeah.
I've raised this elsewhere, and I'd like to raise it here. That in 37, 38, 39, the Caribbean exploded with a host of labour revolts, action on the street where working class people came out in their thousands and thousands to demonstrate against the injustices of the oppression of the colonial government. In Barbados, 19 died, shot by the local police and imperial forces. What I'm wondering is, James obviously would have been aware of that issue. Did he write about it? Did he make any statement about it? And I've always been, as a dramatist, I've always been interested in the if question. Supposing he had not gone to USA in 39, but had gone back to the Caribbean rather in 39, what a difference it might have made to the whole democratic and revolutionary process within the Caribbean. But was there any discussion at all between the Caribbean and James during that hot period of almost revolutionary insurrection?
Yes, James was active in building solidarity with the Caribbean labour rebellions in London, in particular the International African Service Bureau, that he was a sort of leading theoretical figure in, did organise sort of Trinidad solidarity campaigns, also his solidarity campaigns. James wrote about it. He wrote several. He wrote an article about it in Trotsky's paper. He refers to it in History of Negro Revolt in 1938 at the end. I wrote a small article in Small Acts in 2009 on C.L.R. James and the Caribbean labour rebellions of the 1930s, which tries to trace some of it. I think it's tricky. I mean, on one level, it's a quick point. I mean, on one level, it's you could say that it's just, I suppose, a tragedy that on one level that James perhaps didn't go back to the Caribbean at some point for, whatever you might say, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, for an extended period and try and build up an independent sort of Marxist group in the Caribbean, which might have helped, by the time the late 60s came along, might have had a more substantial following and group there. He made efforts that, Selma can talk about. There were small groups around, groups of supporters around. You make that point, but then again, the other side is he went to America, and that was incredibly important for him theoretically as well. So it's swings and roundabouts. If he'd stayed in Britain, it's fascinating what would happen if he stayed in Britain in terms of British Trotskyist movement. He would have been a leading figure of British Trotskyism. He was marginalised when he came back in the post-war period. If he stayed in Britain, he would have been a absolutely central figure throughout the 30s and 40s. He might have reshaped how British Trotskyism turned out. It might have been stronger going into the 40s and 50s. Where, he can't be everywhere at once, can he?
Yeah, thanks to speakers. Thank you.